Okay, great. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you for the introduction. And the way I'm going to do this, I'll introduce a little bit more thoroughly our esteemed panelists that are here on the stage, have them talk a little bit about the organizations and the companies that they work for. And then we're going to get into this issue that Dennis was just alluding to that's been causing a significant amount of economic disruption and consternation across many of the Bitcoin miners that are looking to operate or set up operations here in the US. So, first, I'll introduce to my right Surya Gunesakara. He's also my husband. But in addition to that, he served at U.S. Customs and Border Protection during the last administration. He was a political appointee serving as the head of policy, also served at the Department of Energy, and was tapped for NSC. Um, Working in transnational crime. Prior to that, he's served on Capitol Hill in a number of roles, most prominently as the chief of staff for a Ways and Means member. For any of y'all who pay attention to the various committees on Capitol Hill, Ways and Means is in charge of the tax code. So they do a lot of significant tax code and trade. Thank you. They do a lot of work that directly impacts the economy and well being of this country. Next, we have Danny James, who is the founder and CEO of Compass Logistics and Marine. He is a former Marine, served 20 years, both active and reserve.
Semper Fi.
He served as U.S. Embassy security, numerous other jobs in Southern Command recruiting. He became a licensed customs broker in 2013 and founded CLM in 2017. He brings decades of experience in customs, brokerage, and all the issues that we're going to be discussing most thoroughly today. And finally, Chris Berschel. He is the president of Sea Lion Cargo. This is a Canadian-based global logistics company founded in 2014. He's got a passion for it, a ton of experience moving freight across international borders. He leads teams specializing in air, ocean, and land transportation, offering tailored supply chain solutions from Toronto. So, before we get into what Dennis was just talking about, the problems at the border, could we start? Just do a quick overview of what your companies do. Chris, we'll start with you, and then pitch it to Danny, and then we'll go from there.
Well, as you said, we move cargo across international borders. We fell into the crypto space about 5 years ago. We were a big part of the movement of mines from China into America and Canada. And since then, obviously, all over the world, including South America, into Africa. And I lead a team that specializes on the crypto side called Crypto Logistics. And we do facilitate the international movement, the clearance, and the final delivery to our client sites.
Test, test. Thank you, Mandy, and thank you for having me up here today. So you gave a really good introduction. That's me in a nutshell. I think the thing that's most important to this panel is just the fact that I'm a licensed customs broker. So I've been on the front lines navigating that with US CVP, as well as the 50 plus partner government agencies that they represent for the enforcement of trade. And specifically as it relates to our company, we are a licensed customs broker and international freight forwarder. So same thing that Sea Lion Logistics, Crypto Logistics does to my left. And the unique part is we specialize in technology, crypto being a large part of that. And we also specialize in yacht, marine, and aviation, which if you've driven over the bridge, you can see why that is a very attractive place to be, especially being located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Our headquarters is about a mile from here, and my home's about 3 miles from here, where I have my wife and 3 kids. But same thing as Sea Lion Logistics. We are licensed international freight forwarders, NBOCCs, IATA, and licensed customs brokers.
Great. And I know both of your companies have been really big parts of a lot of the folks in this room shipping their product from point A to point B. Surya, before we get into it, could you just give a quick overview of I went through your background, but what you're doing right now in terms of helping folks engage with the federal agencies or this federal government in general?
Yeah, so in addition to Satoshi Action Fund, Manny and I have a consulting firm called Section 7 Capital, and we have a variety of clients that have different regulatory matters that we help navigate the federal government with. Mandy more on the energy and chemical side, and then I have several trade compliance clients.
Okay, great. Thank you. There. All right. So the stage is set. Now, I would say this is probably a couple months ago. You and I, Surya, were brought into a situation that had been plaguing folks trying to move miners into this country for quite some time. But couple of months ago, we had a number of miners reach out and say that they had received notices that their product was being held. There was some confusion as to why and what agency actually had jurisdiction over it. So, Surya, could you just set the stage with regards to as soon as we were brought in, what we found out, what was going on, and what we've attempted to do since then?
Yeah, so I think this issue started in August or September. Is that right? October, November.
Yeah, early October was our first hold.
Yeah, so we were brought in really pretty late in the process. So I would actually almost kick it over to Danny or Chris to give sort of a timeline for what your customers were going through, and then I'll hop in with a little bit of context at when we were brought in, which was earlier this year.
I'll let you take lead. Cargo.
Yes. So around the same time as Sea Lion, it was about October of 2024, going into November, we started to see shipments get placed on CBP hold. Anyone that's imported is familiar when they have a shipment placed on CBP hold, it likely means additional examination. That's not a problem. That's common course. It doesn't happen the majority of the time. It happens less frequently. But when it does happen, it does mean that customs wants to look at something a little bit deeper. I think when I started to get alarm was the CBP hold was lasting multiple days, sometimes over a week or 2 weeks, without clear and proper notification for why and what or who and how. And that's when I started to become a little bit more alarmed, started bringing in customs attorneys and escalating the matter with the CBP officers at the designated port codes that were in charge of trade enforcement and regulation in the importation. Um, I could take a step back and talk about admissibility and compliance on 101 and what customs is looking for, but I want to give Chris a chance to say what he saw first.
I think what I'd add to that is in our situation, we had holds at 20 different ports of entry. So it became very clear that this was a coordinated effort and being led by a team called the Advanced Targeting Unit. Maybe before we go into too much detail, I just want to give a little bit of a positive. The situation is definitely much better. So let's go and speak about what was happening. But just to give that, we hopefully are at the end of the storm here. But in short, we did have holds at 20 ports. How that was handled was completely different port by port. And kind of within about 30 days, we are getting a better picture. And we were getting a lot of detention notices that were specifically referencing a request for an FCC registration number or permission to use trademarks, which we understood to be FCC trademarks. And we started to begin putting a picture together of what CBP was targeting. But it must be said that at the individual port of entry, so these different 20 ports where there was holds, the officers did not seem to know much. And in the absence of that, they were doing radio silence. So they were not communicating very effectively as one would normally see in these type of situations.
Right. Danny, if you want to go back and give a little bit of what is the normal interaction when you're bringing product into the U.S. What does it normally look like, and how is that engagement? And then what you just explained, how was that different? And we can get into perhaps the why behind it.
No, absolutely. And I will echo the positive sentiments. That's the last few weeks has seen a positive release of, I mean, we've had 50 plus shipments and 5 to 10 different importers. So we are seeing the release of goods. I wish we could provide more clarity, but I'm sure we'll get into that. But the normal interaction is once that targeting unit or that is placed on hold, there's a reason for that hold. It has either been targeted, whether it's just they do random targeting. Sometimes it's built into algorithms. There's certain things that also help you get higher escalated, like CT PAT, and that's something I want to discuss before the end of the program. Um, the fact of the matter is, it wasn't being handled in the way a traditional CBP hold, followed by this is what we're looking at and this is what you need to do, followed by this is what the detention is. Because when you receive from a CBP hold and it goes into additional examination and inspection, those targeting units, as well as any other partner government agency, which I want to reinforce, CBP represents 50 partner government agencies that they enforce regulation and compliance on throughout the US government. And in doing so, they're not always going to give you the clear explanation on which one and why and how. But once the detention notice is issued, it's typically a little bit more defined as to why it's going to be held, how long it's going to be held, and what you can do to proactively or in the meantime do in that period. So that's how I would say the normal process goes. And then depending on what comes out of that detention will subsequently be led to a seizure notice and then giving you your due course and your additional steps that you can take either as the licensed customs broker, the customs attorney, on behalf of the on behalf of the importer of record.
Okay, great. So, Surya, you were brought in after this problem persisted not just for days and weeks, but it turned into many, many months. The lack of clarity was very, very concerning. And coming into the new administration, this seemed like an opportunity not only to reset that conversation, but you also had the president who announced prior to when he was elected on the campaign trail, and then early in the administration issuing an executive order indicating a desire for supporting this industry, making the United States a central place for mining, not just in the world, and also supporting the growth and innovation. So you had this happening at the top, but these problems that impact the bedrock of the industry persisted. So, Surya, you were brought in to reach out to CBP and to FCC. What did you find out? And what do you think, at least for now, what do you think was the motivation or the reason behind some of these holds and the persistent length of them?
Yeah, so we don't actually have a lot of answers, as both Danny and Chris has alluded to. But when we go about looking to sort of solve these bigger regulatory problems, I think one way is sort of just to reverse engineer it with the information we have. There were several miners that had seizure notices or detention notices that referenced FCC authority. And so we looked back at sort of what might be the genesis of that. And in September, around that time, the Biden administration had signaled that they were looking to put on a commerce entity list a chips provider that has relationships with most big mining hardware manufacturers. Company's name is Softco. And that entity list designation is due to Softco's connection with Huawei, which is a giant Chinese telecom company. The FCC has a general policy to prohibit Huawei technology from entering U.S. telecom, U.S. grid, all sorts of things. And it's basically part of now Chairman Carr's rip and replace strategy. So anything that has Huawei components should be ripped out of our telecom system and replaced. So we sort of thought that was actually the genesis, and that's what CBP was moving on direction from the FCC with these detentions. Well, one thing that's important to note about CBP is that it is 67,000 people. You know, the way to break it up is by color. They're the men and women who wear khaki. They fly the planes and drive the boats. They're the air and marine operation. They're the guys in green who patrol between the ports of entry. They're like the border patrol people that you see patrolling the Rio Grande, etc. And then the people in blue that are at ports of entry, checking your passport when you return, examining goods, etc. But in that 67,000 person operation, there are only 5 senior political positions. So it is a very much a independent law enforcement agency without much political oversight and or direction. And I think this is especially true when there is transition. We had an election in November. We had a new administration coming in, and they frankly, at the ports of entry, were not getting a lot of political direction. And I think miners really got caught up in all of that transition. So the first thing we did was reach out to FCC political staff, Chairman Carr's chief of staff, and we were like, "Hey, this is what we think's going on. Can you please tell CBP to stop detaining these miners? Oh, and or tell us why exactly they're being detained." Well, we get a reply. Yeah, so we've done some internal checks, and at no point has the FCC ever directed CBP to detain miners. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a little confounding because there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars of machines that have been detained and racking up tens, if not 20s of millions of dollars in detention, legal costs, etc. So then we elevate it to finally, so the CBP does not have a commissioner yet. There's a nominee who has not yet had a hearing. So the senior most political at CBP is the chief of staff currently, and you know, I raised it with him. He actually worked for me and was my chief of staff in the first Trump administration. So it's helpful to have people that have those relationships. He basically was like, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'll get to the bottom of it. And then we also work with congressional offices that are supportive of Bitcoin mining to pressure the White House to find a solution. And I think a combination of those three pressure points has really helped to get the releases that we're seeing today. Notwithstanding, we still don't understand exactly what the detentions, what precipitated those detentions. And that's what we're working towards today is to find out the why and have clear direction to the ports when a detention is appropriate for ASICs. And so we're working towards that.
So, Surya, you did a good job explaining the various administrative interaction. Both of y'all said that things have gotten better. I assume that means releases. But could you talk about, what has been the result of your constant inquiries from your side of the equation, as well as resetting some of these conversations with the new administration? What is the result of that so far? And are there any lingering issues that still need to be addressed from a practical import perspective?
Well, going back to the issue at the heart of it, at least from what we understood, without going into the minutia of it, is that these units, ASICs in specific, don't require an FCC registration because they fall in a certain category where the manufacturer is allowed to make a self-declaration as long as it's been verified by a third party. It's called Class A. And these Class A devices, basically, if the manufacturer is able to have third-party testing saying they don't interfere or foreign interference will not interfere with our units and they will continue to operate, they don't need a registration number. And so that's a very, very clear law that's in the CFR. However, it's very much open to interpretation. And from our point of view, for I think 2 to 3 months with trade lawyers, a lot of our clients were trying to make the case that it did fall in this exemption category where registration was not required. Today, that's pretty much a moot point because without ever addressing the crux of the issue, we have begun to see releases. And I think that's part of the fruit of that work that was done at a policy level and not at a legal level.
A really good point on the specifics to that exemption, because the FCC rumor, which I don't know have a better word for it, made a lot of sense because FCC regulates electronic devices, computer chips going to be marketed or sold in the United States. So any sort of interference with radio frequencies, electronic device computer chips is of their concern. So it made sense, but we were getting a little bit of conflicting word. And when we were getting that word, it's like, why aren't we getting more word and more definitive? So we continue to go down these rabbit holes, as any good licensed broker is going to do, to try to get to the source. During that time frame, we did encourage engagement of customs attorneys because there is additional weight and leverage that they can pull in addition to what we can do as licensed customs brokers. And we wanted to take a team approach. Now, while this is reactive and we prefer to be proactive, lower the risk ahead of time, the few $1,000s spent on that customs attorney was going to be well worth it if it saved tens of thousands of dollars in additional storage. Um, Without getting ahead of myself, that will go into some of my recommendations moving ahead. But staying focused on, it was FCC, now it's not FCC. We were seeing the different port directors receive the word from a national, but some port directors receiving it later than others and were giving us different mixed signals. And I think that the best way that I could address that question, Mandy, is to look back at what CBP is trying to do as their mission. And they have to balance facilitating economic trade while also balancing illicit activities and national security. That's what they're tasked to do. And when we started to make these cases, Surya was a part of that and tip of the spear. It's like, hey, if there's not something really affecting national security, we're starting to hinder economic trade. So going back to their mission, going back to their own regulations is something that we tried to leverage in order to make progress. And sometimes when you're doing that in the cusp of an administration change, let alone Christmas holidays, let alone X, Y, or Z, we had a few things working as headwinds against us. So if you were to say what things remain unsolved right now, until we get that additional clarification from someone very senior at CBP, FCC, the various government agencies that their mission protects as relates to protecting national security and economic trade, we're not going to have that exact answer. So what I have actually gone back to doing as a licensed broker is advising our clients based on what US CBP is trying to do, and that is admissibility. And when they're focused on admissibility, they're trying to make sure that those goods are properly classified, they're not illicit, nothing is done fraudulently. So I'm trying to answer your question. I'm sorry it took me a little bit to get to the point, but you got to focus on what they are primarily focused on as it relates to admissibility and the importation of goods into the commerce of the United States.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And the more comprehensive, the easier it is for those of us who aren't in the trenches on all of this every day to follow along and understand what's going on. Surya, is it normal, does it happen more often than not, where you've got two agencies essentially pointing the finger at one another, but then when you go and talk to them, they say, no, 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 it's not us, it's them, and then the other agency says, no, 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 it's not us, it's them, as seems to be the case with FCC and CBP. And what do you do to try to navigate that from your position?
Uh, I mean, that's great. That's a loaded question. Manny knew the answer to that question, but then asked it. Of course, the interagency communication is always challenging. And it is largely for big topics the White House's job, as you know, to coordinate. They have these PCCs, policy coordinating committees, where you get different agency heads together to sort of take top-down policy and filter them down and make sure that the respective executive agencies are implementing the policies of the president. That's kind of how Article 2 branch works. Do they frequently not communicate all the time? I think it's very challenging. Wires get crossed. And, with respect to this issue, I understand it's cost a lot of importers a lot of money, and that is a problem. And I recommend you hire good customs attorneys and potentially seek remedies. But as a general thesis, I don't ascribe to malice, which can be explained by ignorance, which is why I think this FCC issue makes a lot of sense. Especially given the timeline with the SOFCO entity listing matches up very well with the first detentions, additional notices of detention or seizure around January 16th, which is when the official BIS SOFCO listing was published in the Federal Register. Um, but then your last part of your question was, how do we fix it? Or
How do you navigate that
uh,
as you're trying to advise?
uh, yeah, I think it can be very challenging, especially sort of a CBP. I think can be especially troublesome because there is not a lot of political leadership and it transitioned from one administration to the other that is especially devoid. Christmas holiday is another thing, and so it is a bit like turning an aircraft carrier. It takes time, and I don't think that the customs officers in those ports of entry were being particularly malicious or trying to hurt the Bitcoin industry specifically. I think they thought they had some directive based on this entity listing and were operating accordingly. Now, administrations change, policy priorities change, and I think that's why we're ultimately seeing releases today. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't get a clear explanation from CBP as to why they started these detentions, under what authority, under whose direction. Like, it doesn't excuse a lack of transparency, and I think that's ultimately what we're trying to get.
Could y'all talk a little bit about the impact to each of your companies or the industries that the various companies, I should say, subsets of the industry that you help manage on the logistics side as well? So when you get these detention notices, there's fees associated with that. What are the extent of those fees in this instance? Who's paying those? Are there opportunities to negotiate with the federal government given this seeming ambiguity around why they were actually held? Could you talk a little bit about that? And then how has this impacted the industry in the macro sense? Is it slowing down the development of Bitcoin mining in the US?
So I think on the first point, how has this impacted our clients? Our clients are essentially miners and brokers would be the two biggest categories for our clientele. And then it's impacted us ourselves. So a lot of time, a lot of resources has gone into this. Speaking to 20 different ports of entry, they are all unique. I would like to say one thing. Back to the topic of CBP. At the end of the day, at the port of entry, this is not an action that we believe started at any one of these 20 ports of entry. And so the men and the women that work there kind of had a hand behind their back because they're receiving instructions and they are limited, and it's not an initiative that they started. So they're limited in what they can communicate to us. But back to kind of the way that it's impacted our clients, the number one biggest thing is economic at this point, because we are seeing a lot of releases, but there's an economic impact. There are third parties that have been holding these goods, often at airport terminals. In some case, we've been successful to move them out of the airport terminals under CBP transfer to move permits. In other cases, we were not. And we do have clients that have seven-figure storage bills, so millions of dollars in storage charges that have accumulated during these holds. And that is a situation we're facing right today in negotiating with these third-party providers. And obviously, there is a mechanism to hold CBP to account for this, but commercially and perhaps also politically, that's a decision that a lot of our clients are trying to balance today. And so that's probably the biggest impact for those that have had their units held and released, is the economic side of it, is paying for the storage charges. Unfortunately, we do still have some general holds, and we also do have some clients that had their units seized prior to the situation getting better, and their ASICs are still being held under seizure notice. So three different solutions. Those that have had it held, they have a bill to pay and a bill to negotiate, which we're actively involved in trying to do. And again, through their own counsel, they are working on that. Then we have some that are still awaiting the holds to be released. And then we have finally some that have a seizure notice, which is probably the highest level that it can escalate to prior to being auctioned or forced to be re-exported. And we do also have two clients that have re-export notices. So we've seen quite a lot of different situations, and they're all being affected in a different way. At the end of the day, they've purchased something from a manufacturer and they are not able to use it. And that's probably their biggest cost at the moment.
Surya, I liked your smile as Mandy asked you that question, because I was going to say, how do you navigate that very professionally and very carefully? when you have two government agencies pointing in that direction. But again, whether it's the efforts that you took, Surya, on behalf of the industry, or some of the big importers or the customs brokers that were involved, it was certainly a team effort to raise the issue, get awareness to it, and the subsequent release. I'm glad that the point about the officers that put on the uniform each and every day are there to uphold their mission, and they're being instructed to do that. And I would never suggest or expect that there was malice. It's just either they didn't know or they couldn't say. And I think it's more of the previous. And they do a great job, and they have a very tough mission. And if you can imagine one agency to be representing 40 to 50 others, there might be some finger pointing from time to time. If you guys have worked in some large companies, other government agencies like the military, that happens as well quite frequently. So not uncommon. How quickly that gets resolved and that gets escalated, that might be, we had a few headwinds against that. How have we navigated it from an economic standpoint? We've advised our clients the risks. There were some importers that were still willing to take the risk, knowing that it was a high risk environment. We tried to take additional steps that we could to explain and inform on that risk. Some of them still took that risk, but we saw a far drop in international shipments. I mean, huge, thousands and thousands of machines got pushed further right. And I think that's probably the biggest economic impact. Those importers, some of which I see in the audience today, had thousands and thousands of machines held up. The opportunity cost, the financial burden of the storage fees. I mean, I'm sure Chris as well has had some success. We've been able to negotiate hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings with some of these ground handling agents, given the complexity and ambiguity of this situation. But that's not a shoe-in or a guarantee. That's just something we've done. And that time, a lot of the time on our behalf, whether it's as a freight forwarder, customs broker, we're not charging extra. We're just doing on behalf of our service to our customer. So there's been a lot of additional time and energy spent on helping our customers navigate this complexity, because it's been going on for many months.
Surya, do you have anything to add on this? So, okay, what advice do y'all have? I want to hear from y'all, and then Surya, you after. What advice do you have for folks who are continuing to have to navigate what remains a bit of a unclear process? It is clear for some shipments, but folks coming in, what is your advice for navigating it, number one, and some possible solutions to fix it?
Well, I'd say number one is trade compliance. So in terms of documentation, in terms of country of origin, in terms of valuations, if you're starting from the right point, you're more likely to be successful than if you're starting from having a little gremlin or having something that you didn't do quite properly at the time that there's an investigation. And some of these holds that we've seen are now shifted attention to other items in terms of valuation, in terms of who the right to make entry, who the importer of record was. And that's just a demonstration. We work extremely professionally. We are a very compliant organization, and we have had good success, at least in our holds, where those questions have been asked. Those further questions have been asked to mitigate the concerns of the officer. But in this environment, I would say number one is follow the law. Be transparent about your transactions. Make your records available as quickly as you can. And maybe don't chastise officers. We have had some clients that were quite upset. It really affected their business, and some wanted to pick a fight. And I totally understand that, but it's probably not the best remedy to the situation. And then ultimately, yes, there are different ways, and I'll let Danny speak a little bit more about that because you mentioned it first. But there are different ways to assure the CBP and the U.S. government that your supply chain is compliant and that you're acting in a professional way, both with the partners that you're working on and your own internal procedures. Maybe I can flip that to you, Danny. I would also recommend that to clients.
Chris, I appreciate that. I couldn't say it better than you did as it relates to just being compliant, knowing that U.S. Customs is going to look at admissibility. Some of the things they're looking at with admissibility is all the things Chris just mentioned as it relates to proper documentation, proper tariffs, proper valuation, nothing fraudulent, nothing lacking transparency, because those are the quickest ways to have more problems. So that's our advice not to do. And there's ways that your customs broker or your customs attorney, et cetera, can assist with that. As it relates to additional things to be proactive, I think that's one of the big points I want to make today. Is they say that that the ounce of preparation is going to save that pound of flesh, or the ounce of homework. Just do the homework, do the due diligence up front, so that it saves the pain later. Because spending a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, really making sure that you are meeting the trade enforcement side of CBP and the compliance side and the admissibility side is going to be far beneficial than the cost that it's going to take you to. And then if you do end up in a reactive way, at least you have some of the headway that you've already made with some of your research and the things that you've done with your customs broker in order to do that. I will take it a step further and say that there are some clients that, just like with you, Surya, we are taking an additional step with the light of the higher risk scenario, where we are actually going down with the Center for Excellence and some of the CBP officials in order to further document some of the suppliers and some of the product codes and the product specifications to make sure. That being said, I don't want any of us in this audience to be unaware of more turbulence ahead as it relates to this industry. So I think that's another good point to discuss, because when you hammer that, or when you mention that question, there's got to be diversification. There's got to be, I mean, what is it? Pro US manufacturing. I think most of the major miners are going that direction. I hope you can address on that a little bit more, because I think this is at an administration level. So whether you're seeing the tariffs and whether you're seeing the, I can't remember, the International Emergency Economic Power Act, probably the first time a lot of you guys have heard that. That was the 10% that got thrown on top of the 25% from the previous Trump administration. Well, that 10% just became 20% in the month of March. So just the fact that those are like layers on top of layers of duties and tariffs, and we're supposed to be looking at the reciprocal duty for various countries, we have potential risk and additional threats in front of us that I don't think we can go blindly into the future and not thinking that they exist, because they're being discussed, they're being updated. We're getting the updates as fast as you guys are, sometimes at a press conference, sometimes at a tweet, and we're trying to navigate and advise our clients on how to navigate that as safely as possible. So being proactive to it, having diversification, any additional efforts that you can take in that manner are going to be time, energy, resources well spent, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really great advice. So, clearly work with experts who've been around the industry for quite some time. And I think some of the best advice is, if you find yourself on the receiving end of some of these notices, it's never ever a good idea, even though you want to, and it's probably well deserved. Do you express anger towards the regulator that you're going to have to continue to work with, so long as you stay active in your industry? That's really sound advice. Okay, Surya, looking ahead a little bit, what do you foresee changing or not on the import side of the equation? We know the president has talked about wanting to onshore U.S. Bitcoin mining. A lot of that manufacturing, it exists overseas. A lot of that is from Southeast Asia. What do you foresee will play out over the next few years with regards to potential onshoring, and then also on the enforcement at the border? Do you foresee stricter, better efficiencies? Any comments on what people could expect given the changing political and policy landscape?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be really challenging for CBP from an administratability standpoint. On April 2nd, these reciprocal tariffs will go into effect, which, I predict will affect all Southeast Asian countries. They have various VATs and tariffs against American goods. From a holistic standpoint, I think the Trump administration views tariffs in two buckets. There's sort of like the coercive tariffs, like on Canada and Mexico, which are meant to be painful to force a particular policy outcome, whether that's, increased border security related to fentanyl and human persons. And then there is sort of the playing field tariffs, which is what the reciprocal tariffs are meant to do. The president views them very much as sort of like a consumption tax uh, that will cover a broad breadth of categories. You know, if you did the math, there could be 13 million new tariff codes based on sort of like that and other countries that tariff us. I think they'll probably use some form of weighted average. But obviously that is very complicated for CBP to one sort of implement. You know, they have, I would say their software system is due of a Doge overhaul. They spent billions of dollars on Ace, and it's still not that great. Um, but these are all things that I think are going to continue to challenge this industry, which you know, is decentralized by nature, but it is becoming a more mature industry in the United States. We have lots of publicly traded miners, you know, who have significant scrutiny from various regulators. So I think as more Bitcoin mining comes to the United States, we need the manufacturers to sort of invest in sort of a longer term US strategy that includes having American logistics planners, American trade compliance personnel, as well as legal personnel. I think that the most successful Chinese, Korean manufacturers are the ones that have a robust American workforce that can help them comply with American laws. The most successful American companies that do business in China have good local workforce, good local legal, good local trade compliance. And I think the idea that you can set up a manufacturing facility in Southeast Asia and import into the US with just a handful of sales team here. President Trump doesn't agree with that, and he's going to make it painful for people who think that that's the way that you can continue to operate.
Yeah. So, Chris and Danny, I'll pitch it to you in our time remaining. Just any general closing remarks on this issue, and then also any predictions you see along the same vein of what Surya was just talking about, given this shifting landscape. And yes, this president and the administration, including the crypto slash AI czar at the White House, David Sachs, who's leading a lot of these initiatives, are very supportive of the crypto industry in general. But what predictions do you foresee with regards to your company's role in this industry? And then any general closing remarks you want to leave the folks with as we wrap things up.
I would definitely echo the sentiment about equalizing the playing field. I think that's really important. I don't think there's any industry that is produced 100% in the USA. There is always foreign manufacturers, there's always foreign distributors in the market, but those tend to be established businesses that are working, that have proper representation in the US and are fully compliant. And I think that's what's important. And I do see that not only on the issue of the FCC, on various other topics, if the manufacturers are not actively engaged with the administration, with CBP, with the various different departments, they will continue to face headwinds. And all the consumers, the logistics professionals, the customs brokers in the process won't be able to solve those problems. Because at the end of the day, you're speaking about the manufacturers and who are selling into the US market. So that would be number one. What we see our role, we see ourselves as more than just logistics professionals. We are not just trying to move a box from A to B. We are trying to advise our clients on how best to do that. And so we're actively involved in that. We have our trade lawyers assisting our clients, and we will continue to do that as we go forward. And as much as gets onshored in the USA, we're fully supportive of that. We're happy to do that. In many different industries, Sea Lion is going far further down the supply chain of sourcing components, of bringing them to factories for the production. So we don't see that as at all a threat to our business. We would be happy to work with the manufacturers. We do work with some of them, but we'd be happy to work with all manufacturers to assist that process of setting up assembly or manufacture in the USA.
I think for closing remarks, I think the fact that this panel was put together for this conference is important in and of itself. This is very real. This is a risk, but it's also an opportunity. So for us to all have the awareness around some of these things, have a little bit more information and knowledge on how to bring it back and make less risky decisions, mitigate that risk. Because one thing's for sure is the geopolitical landscape is changing, the trade lanes are changing, and you have to build risk mitigation strategies into your supply chain, and you got to build a resilient supply chain. So any bit of effort, energy, time, resource, education that you put into that, if you have anything to do with your supply chain and your importation compliance, is going to be time well spent as you move into it. Whether you go to the extreme of the program, which they call CTPAT, those of you all that want to be in that category above with the customs, I'm going to mispronounce it here. I had it written down here somewhere, but customs trade partnership against terrorism. That is something that is a few $1,000s or a few months of work, which a lawyer can do for you and put in place and put you a rung above for US CBP and those partner government agencies, versus the diversification and having some US manufacturing, versus the diversification and having some diversity in where your supplier sourcing is. If you put all your eggs in one basket, you're putting yourself at risk. And I think just being able to mitigate that risk, having your advisors that are going to be here to help you navigate that and do it in a smart, efficient, and effective way would be the biggest thing that I would want to leave everyone with.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You need to invest in becoming a trusted trader. I think that's super helpful for CBP. I mean, I'll just in our last 15 seconds say that I think the trade landscape is going to be more complex, which is why you need talented people like Danny and Chris on your team. And I think it'll be an interesting few years to watch this industry really mature and sort of, you know, become a part of the U.S. ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you to our panelists. If y'all could join me in a round of applause for them. I guess the takeaway is hire the experts if you're bringing things in, and if things get stuck, folks like Surya, myself, Satoshi Action Fund, and others regularly engage with these various federal agencies, and we can try and apply pressure or work things out from the top so that we can continue to see this really fundamental aspect of the industry grow, especially here in the USA. Y'all join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you, and we'll move on to the rest of the programming.
Thank you very much.